Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's good to see you all here. Thank you for coming out and joining us. I'm Spencer Crew. I am the chair of the external board for the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And it's really my honor to be that chair, but even more so an honor to be here this afternoon. I like to say that we're here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the center, because it is a very important activity and organization and institution at this museum at Brown University. And it's interesting because when it first got started 10 years ago, what it was asked to do, or at least what it followed on, was the study of Brown itself, looking at Brown's connection to slavery and to slavery's impact on the creation of this institution. And in the process, a number of, I think, very important questions were asked, and inquiries made about Brown, and having Brown think about what this means and what's it going to do about it. And part of it was the creation of the center, which I think was a very important aspect of that taking place. I think what's happened since is that it's been a very productive decade of work that's followed. A decade of work of beginning to make very intense inquiries about the nation at a time when the nation sorely needs it. That this has been a time, as you all very well know, of great turmoil in the nation in terms of really beginning to think about what does it stand for and what do these documents, these founding documents, really mean in terms of freedom and equality and fair treatment of individuals and social justice. And what the center's been able to do through its work, through the center staff and through its collaboration with institutions across the nation and with faculty here at Brown, to really do a number of programs and other kind of activities that really inquire into this issue and ask very hard questions of our nation and of all of us about what do we stand for and what is important to us as a nation. It's been exciting to watch that unfold. It's been exciting to watch the hard work of the staff. And I'm looking forward to another decade at least of work by this center, because I think it's a vital part of this institution, but a very important voice for this nation to keep us thinking about how we can get better and better and how we can come closer and closer to the ideals that are supposed to represent this nation. As I say, I'm excited about the work done over the last 10 years, but I'm looking forward even more to the work that's to come, and looking even forward even more today to the program today and to the people who have a part of it. But before we move to that part, I'd like to introduce Anthony Bogues, who's the director of the center, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Dr. Spencer. I'd like to begin by thanking you all, both those who are here in person, as well as those who are online, for joining us today. It's a hybrid meeting. We had to debate about how to do it. We didn't want to put it off, so we just thought we'd do it hybrid by having people here, but in space, with public health protocols, and then also by focusing on, by inviting people to join us virtually. Let me just say I would want to thank all the folks who are participating in today's program. Dr. Spencer Crew, who's the chair of the External Advisory Board, Desiree, who to me remains one of the most important young black poets in this country, who will be read and also be in conversation with Kevin Kwashi, who is a member of the External Advisory Board. But I'd also like to thank Shana and Kiku, who who put this together. This particular program is the beginning of a series of programs that will continue up until December 22. In those programs that we are planned, we will have, just to give you some highlights, we will have a major conference on public history and monuments. We will also have another major conference on reparations. And then we'll also have a retrospective exhibition with 3 of the artists who we have worked with over the last decade: Edward Duval Carrier, Jess Hill, African-American female artist from Atlanta, who is just absolutely brilliant, and Lauren Renaud, who is an artist from Haiti. The 10th anniversary of any institution is a time to reflect, obviously, on the history on the past of that of that institution, what it has done, what it has not done, what its achievements have been. But it is also a moment to map how we go forward and what that going forward may look like. And so during the course of this year, not necessarily academic year, but a calendar year from December to December, we hope to be planning and mapping with our various partners as well as with our various boards, both the academic board and external board, how it is we go forward for the next 10 years to make this center a very sustainable site on Brown's campus. That will not be in 10 years' time, just be 20 years old, but whoever is here 10 years' time can talk about what does the next 10 years look like. In thinking about the persons who have made this possible, and it would not have been possible without persons, I want to name a few people and just pay tributes to some of them. Firstly, I want to name Dr. Ruth Simmons, because it was her vision about a committee to study the role of Atlantic slavery in the foundation of Brown University that led to a recommendation in which we then posited, one of which items we posited was that there should be a center for the study of slavery and justice. And to say this story that not many of you know, that I was actually on my way somewhere else, and when I got a call from Ruth to say, I don't think you're going to go where you want to go. I think you need to come back here, right? And I did, because A, it was her, and B, because I was also part of the group that wrote the report, and was served on the committee. I'd also like to pay special tribute to the members of the External Advisory Committee who have worked with the center for many years since its inception. Dr. Simmons was the first chair, so she's now the emeritus. And that's Spencer Crew, David Haas, Libby Heinmark, Jim Campbell, as the original members of that external board. Jim Campbell being the chairperson of the steering committee that wrote the report. And then we have 3 new board members who have just joined us. Pablo Rakim, who is a former Africana Studies student, who is a Rhodes Scholar, and the first Africana Studies Rhodes Scholar student, who's now a lawyer and works in Washington, D.C. And Emily Kavanagh, who just joined us last week to the board. So I would like to thank them. Then I'd also like to thank the academic advisory board. 2 members who are here, Kevin and Juliet, so thank you very much. And then there's Professor Seth Rothman, Matt Gottrell, Phil, and Phil from the Department of English, to just thank them as well for serving and Francois Hamlin for serving on the board, academic advisory board. And then I would really like to thank all the staff members, Shana, Kiku, Catherine, Maya, and Ruth. These are people who have worked with us over the years. Ruth was one of our first coordinators, and we miss her still. And she left and went to Vietnam to teach, and is now back in the United States. Then I would like to thank all our student workers. Too numerous to name, quite frankly. We could not have done this work without the number of students, undergraduates and graduate students, who passed through the center and who did everything that there was to do, from picking up the mail to making sure things were tidied up after meetings, to sometimes hosting meetings themselves, to developing projects which they hosted themselves. It's just it's impossible to actually talk about the breadth and depth of the work of all the student workers. And then I'd also like to thank our undergraduates and graduate student fellows who have also worked with us. And again, they have done everything that one needs to do, but they have also intellectually been at the cutting edge of many of the things that we have done. Our Castro State Reading Group is a graduate and undergraduate led group. Our group on advanced knowledges is a graduate-led group with postdocs. I mean, you know, that's so. And it's because they see this work of the center as very much cutting-edge intellectual work. And then there are the visiting professors and visiting scholars, two of whom are here, Dr. Jones and Marcelo, who are here, and then also our visiting faculty associates. In particularly, I would like to recognize Professor Jerry Augusto, who is a visiting associate, faculty associate, and in my recognition for her is about the work she has done developing the slave garden, which stands out as something that is still one of the features of the life of the center. She was with us from the very moment that we decided we got that building, and she was with us as we argued with the facilities and administration that not everywhere in Brown had to be green in a certain flat kind of way, that we could think of, we could begin to think of other ways of landscaping. And since we were going to be a center for the study of slavery and justice, it might be important to develop a different kind of landscape around the center. We won that argument, but it was a constant discussion with folks about why is this not flat and green in a certain way. Then I would want to just thank the president, Christina Paxson, for her support of the center, as well as the dean of the faculty, who I see, I think he's walking in, Kevin, for his continued support of the center, as well as the provost for his support of the center. Then I would want to thank the Brown's lawyer, Yolanda. Many of us would not have to deal with Yolanda, but because of the work that we do, which requires us to have memorandum of understanding with many external organizations, the Smithsonian, the organizations in Africa, then we have had to work with Yolanda, and that's been an interesting experience. Of working with somebody who is a very clear legal mind, and then working with us at the center, who wants to get things done, and the conflict between wanting to get things done and making sure that we can get the things done and not go through too many bureaucratic hoops, and then making sure that that the legal things, all the I's and T's are dotted and crossed, has been it's been a learning experience on both sides. But I think we have actually come out of it. Each of us have come out of it with a greater appreciation of each other. And so Yolanda has been really central to that, and she's leaving here, and we are doing something for her tomorrow morning. Then there is Sarah Walker, who is important to us because of the human resources and staff. Again, I mentioned these people. All these relationships are not smooth. We don't but what they have been is interesting kind of ways that we have learned to work together, and around a certain objective, which is the actual growth of the center. And that to me is, has been really interesting to watch people who we begin to work with who kind of insist on a brown bureaucratic stamp, come to a position that, okay, perhaps we can do this if we do that, if we do this, if we do that, then we might be able to do certain things. And so I would just want to thank them very much for that. And then I really would like to thank two other persons who we have worked in development, Alicia and Alicia and Mike. And they have been really critical for us as we work to raise funds for the center. Very critical. We have worked with both of them very closely to think about development strategies, to think about prospective donors, and so on. And they've really just been very supportive and sometimes relentless in making sure that some of these things happen. So I want to just thank you all very much for thank all of them, and just two other persons, who do what some of us would call invisible labor. And the two persons I want to talk about is Maria, our custodian, who does invisible labor. Really invisible because it's done at night. So it happens, so when we turn up in the morning at 8, 9 o'clock, the place looks the way it looks. And I would just like to thank her really very much. She's from the, she's just a remarkable person. And also Robert, who's our facilities person. Again, that's invisible labor. You see him in the morning and you see him late at night. Again, working in the garden, but also working around the center, clean up and so on with snow and all the things that come from the kind of New England climate that needs to be cleaned up after a certain time. So I really want to pay special attention, thank those two persons, because they do invisible labor, but without that labor, quite frankly, the center would not, just wouldn't function. And so to thank you all very much for coming. Thank everybody else who has worked with us, Amanda from the library and so on, who have come who worked to make the center a really special and significant place on campus. I am told by students and some faculty, but primarily by students, that this is a special place, and I get letters about that fairly regularly. That it's a different kind of space on campus, people say. And particularly, I'll be very frank, people of color say that this is a space in which they think that represents them in some way. Even if they have disagreements with us. And I think if we can, to get that kind of accolade, if you want to put it, or that kind of commentary, I think, about us is absolutely important. As I close, I want to single out somebody who has been the backbone of the administrative work of the center. That's Ms. Shana Weinberg. When Ms. Weinberg and I began doing this work, we began in a place called the dungeon. That's what the kids call it, which is the one room over in the alumni hall. We weren't quite sure what was going to happen and how we were going to do this. And today we have two buildings, one at 94 Waterman and the other one at 86 Waterman. But I would want to say to folks both who are listening and watching virtually, as well as the folks here, is that all of the work that we have done was simply made possible by her administrative genius in many ways. That Ms. Weinberg, when it came to being a curator, part curator for public humanities programs, she was there. And there's one particular project that we did in South Africa, which I will never forget, because the staff, the workers, the cleaning women, the custodians at that museum came to me and asked and told me about her. And this is when, after everything was done, we had done the opening ceremony and, drank enough wine, good South African wine, and so on and so forth. And Ms. Weinberg joined the staff, the cleaning staff, in cleaning up the place. And they came to me about it after. about the kind of humility, but the way in which we were as a center recognizing their labor in a way that other people, even in South Africa, did not. And that always struck me, and I've never said this to her, but when they came to me and said it, I said, oh, at least on that decision, you made a right one, Tony. All right, in employing her. And so from not just that, but there's a kind of administrative genius that is done with a certain ethical skill, which I think was important, which represents the ethos of the center itself, which is we try to do it, which is the ethos of justice, which has attached to it dignity, respect for people. But she has done curatorial work. She has done all the major administrative work, which includes grant reporting, writing up all these laborious things as we go for grant. The staff to the external board, in particular. And she is now the Associate Director for Public Humanities Projects at the center. But I would want to say that our growth would not have been possible without that administrative skill and the ethics that go with that skill. So what I thought that would be, she doesn't know this, what I thought would be appropriate is really a small token in the 10th anniversary of paying tribute to this remarkable person who has worked with us at the center. Ms. Weinberg.
Thank you very much.
Okay, all yours, Spencer.
Thank you, Dr. Boggs. You've thanked a lot of people, and it illustrates the kind of support and kind of dedication that people have to this program. But you left someone out who needs to be thanked very much so, and that's you. This never could have happened, never would have blossomed the way it had without your leadership, without your intellectual heft, without your dedication to making this center one of the most important places on this university. So before we go anywhere else, I just wanted to thank you and applaud you for your hard work over the 20 years. Now it's my pleasure to get us to the heart of this program and to, I think, the intellectual heft of the program. We'll begin with some poetry reading by Desiree Bailey, and then that will be followed by a conversation between she and Kevin Kwashi about her work and what she's doing. But let me give an introduction to each of these very distinguished individuals. First of all, Desiree Bailey is the author of What Noise Against the Cane, published in 2021, which won the 2020 Yale Series of Young Poets Prize and was a finalist for the 2021 National Book for Poetry. She is also the author of the fiction In Dirt or Salt Water, published in 2016, and has short stories and poems published in Best American Poetry, Best New Poets, American Short Fiction, Callaloo, the Academy of American Poets, and elsewhere. It's a long list of places where you've been published. Desiree is from Trinidad, Tobago, and Queens, New York, and she currently lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Which is your favorite place? No need to answer. And she'll be joined in conversation by Kevin Kwashi, who is a professor in the Department of English here at Brown University and a member of the Faculty Advisory Board of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. He's the author or editor of 4 books, most recently, The Sovereignty of Quiet, Beyond Resistance in Black Culture, published in 2012, and Black Aliveness, or A Poetics of Being, published in 2021. Currently, he's thinking about a book of Black ideas and Black sentences. Now, Desiree.
Thank you so much, Spencer, for that introduction. And thank you, Professor Boggs, really for so much. A lot of people don't know that actually the long poem that I think is the heart of this book started as a final project in his class. And so, for all of the educators in the room, I want to say, please encourage that creativity because, it opens up so many possibilities for your students. It feels so good to be here. I haven't been back at Brown in about, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years, and so this really feels amazing. And so thank you to everyone who really made today possible, and also to the CSSJ for again being a home for so many of us on campus. I was in the literary arts program, but I was here. I was, and also in the Africana Studies program as well. So that was a home for me while I was here. I'm gonna get into some poems, and I'm probably gonna talk a little bit in between them, and hopefully I can keep track of time, or someone can just, hold up a hand if I go a little bit over the time. And so in the bottom margins of this book, there's a line of text that runs all throughout the book that I call the sea voice, and so I will start there. Crow does fly high, but when he come down, ants does eat out the eye. And the breeze keep on blowing like she never even know crow name. And the ants love meat when it's sweetened by a great fall. Hear how the rain make music in the bones. Hear how she drum on the remains before washing it into my wide, wet mouth, my body spread out, squeezing the coast like a jammet. Yes, I's a jammet, I'm a chin up high. Drink and be drunk, drink and drown, sinking down in my boneyard. You have to come correct when it come to me. You have to touch me, praise me, treat me like a queen. So bring the duck, the white roses, white wine and honey. Sweeten up my pum-pum, make my belly feel good. I here doing me, flowing how it does always flow. But everybody does do what they want with me. Say that I's Yamayan, Mizuchi, and how Venus shell out herself from me. Say that in my body is all kind of king and beast. Even Miss Ting, Miss Poet, who thinks she writing me here. Give me this voice, like a voice that she afraid to forget. Syntax cut up and ring up with Shadow Benny and Congo Pepper. So I go take the voice and make it sing, make it roar like a hit in the peak of my pleasure. But oh God, that child is worried. That poet does ton and ton. She mind worse than a wave. I really appreciate the and first of all, let me just say this is the second in-person reading that I've had since I released this book. And so I've been doing lots of readings, but they've all been on Zoom, of course, and that's been great. But this is amazing, actually, to just be in the same space as an audience. I'm not used to the and the so thank you. I appreciate you. This next poem is called Chant for the Waters and Dirt and Blade. It's a long poem that really has roots in that class that I took with Professor Bogues. And it is set during or at the onset of the Haitian Revolution. And so I will jump around and read from different parts of the poem. I am I, but I won't spill my name. Not here on this damned rock, pushed out bloody from the bowels of the sea. Marketplace Island where the clouds crest and bird song all for sale. Prophet of my black, my stewed puss on the plate, in the belly of my captor. What am I? What dare I? Grease up to quiet the squeak. A howl camouflage destined to burst forth. Murderous as a wave, meek today, tomorrow, cupped for my inheritance of rage, my name soldiers up like bile, but I dare not allow it, swallow it, bury it, down with the other human parts of me, I, husk of girl orphaned at the ocean's distant edge, before ship, before humid choke of hull, before trade wind splintering me off into the world's directions, a girl and I, unbroken and spotless, smooth as obsidian's kiss. Until I can eat what my hands have made, I am a castaway, a hound tied up, skin gnawed down, gleam of bone in the arrowed sun. What kind of life we do and do, till, clear, dig, grind, months, years measured by cane. Melody of home, a ruthless drift, a song that doesn't return. I dream the sea scabbed over, a hush across her blue-black lips, the scaled mother below circling, swimming the wound, the scaled mother hurling her body against the crust of hurt, pickaxe of tail and spine until there an opening. Oh, my forgetful, singed love, our sea is not, can never be the wound. We shadows beneath shadows, stone interred in stone. I, somebody, I, daughter of seagrass. I don't always remember when the whole flings its dirt against the coming dark. O horizon and deep sky, hex me to be sexless like the mermaid, hunkered into her scales, a shut sweetness I am not offered, the cool privacy of fish. I see no use for all these doors if they do not serve me first. I envy the stone, the ordinary shoe. Somehow I more object than they. Knowing line in the sky, salt and dry me, fuse me out of use. My hands, my womb, whittled to a tool. To build what? A white man's skull temple, his leaning empire of ash and bone, his coffee, his cane arrows towards the death of everything. The land chewed up, the skinned forest, his god within the vulture's jaw, the island made into a wicked stain, a lump in the throat of my mother. But if not here, then where, crude shadow of home, my blood, my grief glistens the soil. The land and me stubborn kin. The land made me a new being, forged of a greedy flame, my blood already here. My God's breathing in the hills, in the slow tilt of evening, my God stir me into a battle song. My muck, my cane, my muddy island, my life, my death, my cliffs, my body's bloom. What smoke, what threadbare cry, what child strung between, what architect of light, what leaf for the wound, what mountain and scar, what keloid, what mother, what sweat in the eye, what sojourning soul, what thrust in the dark, what hole, what belly, what babe without breath, what route to the hills, what dance, what drumbeat to call, what freedom, what body, what precipice of hope, what danger, what master, what whalebone, what poison meat, what pillage feel, what noise against the cane, what blaze, what sky, what name to call myself. And so I'll read a little bit more. I think I'm still doing okay on the time. I'm gonna read a little bit more from the second half of the text, which is really more in a contemporary spirit. Guesswork. True, there is no homeland, just my veined feet wandering the shore, marring paradise. Regretful inconvenience I am, smudge in the eye of a tourist camera. Vagrant is what I learned to call the man with snarl of sky for a roof. And how now that word turns inward, taking root within the spleen. I am not lost, or am I? Light a white candle, says a friend, his pupils storming within mine. Neighbor it to a glass of water, flame and water to uncover a path, to greet the ones who walked moons before. damn near atheist on so many days. But I touch the flame to the wick and my head is light, light, it's lifting. Diasporan daughter, raking the soil for a map, a glint of my mama's gold, a bone to call my own. See me, saga gal in kente pum pum shorts, thighs shaped buttered, Fulani hoops twisting a secret beside my face. I fix my mouth to say black girl. I twist my tongue to say magic. Yet when the day turns, I scorn this empty-bellied scavenging, the traditions fumbled, then swirl to mud. I want to say I am from nowhere and everywhere, but that feels coy, like I am lifting my skirt for the empire's gaze. Even if it is true, on my papers and certificates, there's a country and another country. I can reach beyond, trace the soils through a strand of hair or swab of cheek. But what after? Forever of lineage riven and ruptured. So I search only because I can. And sometimes I exist more and more each day. A brown cotton doll stuffed and stitching the X for her own inadequate eye. This next poem is called Woman in Dub, and I have to say that it really comes out of, I don't know, just an obsession with dub, really, and it's specifically inspired by the late Lee Scratch Perry's Chase the Devil. Lee Scratch Perry and Max Romeo's Chase the Devil. Side A. The devil I see is the one I saw and nail out of fears, out of cycles of wound, dread calcifying into prophecy. I put on an iron shirt to chase it, face it, but the cops still piss drunk with power. I put on an iron shirt, but the men on the street surveil the nipple. Been hounding my punani since before I spilled my first blood. What a menace of a body. I hurl blame to the husk. Is the devil real, or is it of my fantastical making? The answer is not the matter. The fact of paranoia be the true violence, warfare, the very presence of the question. I want to peer inward, to take a good look at the sound system, my heartbeat echoing out of my folkloric thirst, my desperate belief in other realities, a B-side where I'm abolished from emotional labor, aka black woman's burden, free to surrender to my own madness, to sink down into the dub of it, stripped of my first voice, reverbing outside the pain of a body. Side B. Stripped of my first voice, down in the dub, cop hounds my blood into paranoia, a black reality, cycles spilled, power husked, emotional woman, I iron, real street, folkloric and mad, true. Take a good look at the devil, peer into the dread. Men surrender to wound, drunk, calcified, but I fantastic, chasing echoes, nailed to system, free in sound. I a fact, answer of my own making. And so I'll read one more poem, and it's the last poem of the book, and it's called Chant for the Waters and Dirt and Blade, Slight Return. A memory of the cemetery flooded with the murmur of the living, the candles' small fires nesting on the graves, my grandfather and we, his thin-limbed offspring. Every year in the humid dark, each All Saints' Day, the mosquitoes rising from the grasses to feed. Every year we light We pray that our dead will not forget the chant below our skins. The scent of melting wax will always call forth the memory of our dead. The unheard footfalls, the bodiless rustling through the dashing leaves. On this Hallows Eve, I am listening to the cars sounding their grievances on Flatbush Avenue, while hemming words in my apartment, wishing that I could wake up tomorrow in my first country to visit what remains of my grandfather, to go to him, to the cemetery of his mother, his father, and the wax riding the damp air, its fragrance winding beyond the dark palm prints of a bacano tree. Who, what, how do I believe? My worship colonized, my gods painted in a foreign face, my grief song milked in the raised woods, shipped off, most wanted commodity. I stuff my ears against the old spirit's call, fearful of the way the past speaks to me. I cling to cold reason, but find empire's grasp especially there. I believe in what makes me free. I believe in the red-hot flowers crowning the head of the flamboyant tree. I believe in nutmeg ground down for cassava pone, and the hands, the firm singing hands that push its measurements through the decades. My goddess is the wave unsheathing, my name strung through the conch's contralto. Where will we live, I ask my ocean-torn love? Where will we raise our children if my fibroid womb will allow we of many soils, we who know the curse is the blessing is the curse, we of many and no homes, we who destroy and build, who send our love haunts along the currents? Whether quick clapping of hands or hymns of lambs and mercy, or fistful of cowrie thrown across a mat, or psalms to tread the lion and the cobra, or cymbals drawn in cornmeal guarded throughout the brutal passage. I fear that I will never be fully at home, that the very first leaving cracked the skull of my belonging, that when I eventually stop moving, I won't understand the land's grieved tongue. I brown the sugar in the heavy bottom pot to fill up every space, to remind myself of language. I belong to the foam that singes the sand where I was thrown to the waves just weeks into the world. My eyes widening to limestone cliffs, to see almonds ripening upon the shore. My hands are the scarlet ibises soaring the salt-washed dawn, cleaving the sky open like a blade. Thank you all so much for listening.
Well, first, let me say thank you. Can we give Desiree again another round of applause? It feels like a particular gift to have you reading these poems, these magnificent poems, in the state of the world of things that we're in. And the incredible reminder that your care and intelligence is that in the midst of terrible, there's also grace. And this book is, it is a fantastic book, and we're so grateful that you've made it, and we're grateful you're here. So thank you, thank you. Thank you for reading.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wonder if we could start. Will you say something about, you mentioned that in your time in Professor Bogues' class that the long poem had its genesis there. Will you say something about the making of this book, how this book came together, and maybe in responding, would you also say something about the title?
Yes, absolutely. So, really, the book is in 2 or maybe even 3 parts, depending on how you look at it. But the first part of the book really came out of so many of the ideas that that I was learning and really inspired by in that course. It was an art and politics of Haiti course taught by Professor Bogues, and we looked at so many different aspects, both the visual art, but also thinking about religious aspects that are often overlooked in its significance towards the Haitian Revolution. And that was something that really stuck with me, thinking about the role of voodoo, right? And so when we had this final project to think through, I guess, what we had learned in that course, I was drawn to that because I thought, well, here's a space that where I can actually attempt to understand, I think, the psyche and maybe even the psycho-spiritual of what people were moving through at that time. And because, we're quite limited in what we have in terms of the ideas of, I would say, someone who was an everyday person, right? Someone who is not necessarily noted in history books. I thought that this is a place where I can at least begin to think about that. Mm-hmm. And so, of course, I was also thinking about La Sirène, the ocean spirit of the sea. And some stories say that she swam from the Congo to Haiti alongside the slave ships. And so I thought about that as well in the formation of this poem. And really, as someone, right, in the contemporary world, thinking about that risk and what it means to actually put your body on the line for your freedom. It's not something that I know and that I can ever say that I will ever know, but I really just wanted to honor that. And really in that space, right, with so much going on, there was also a part of me that thought, well, we should be talking about this all the time. Like, we should really be talking about this moment as something that is pivotal and really at the center in many ways of, I would say, our modern world. And so I felt like, well, this is my small part in really pushing forward that vision and hoping that other people then begin to speak this and possibly also find their own ways at looking towards history in order to inform perhaps their present moment and maybe to inspire them to think about the ways that they can make change and the way that they can work towards a kind of freedom.
One of the things I hear in the response you just gave is a real attention to trying to manage the scale, and maybe we can say two related but very different scales in the book. One is the kind of epic scale of the wrath of slavery, and then the kind of intimacy. You use the language of the psyche or the psycho-spiritual, or even you're talking about the body and trying to imagine the figure of the person who swims right across the ocean. And so I wonder if some of the Carl Phillips, who wrote the introduction and who was the judge for the prize, the iconic poet, and many commentators of the work, as someone who's now studied the work for the last couple of weeks, I see you managing scale in the book. And I wonder if you would say something about the poetics of that management of scale, a thing I read as, again, your way of trying to reckon with the wrath of slavery. Can you say something about that? And I'd be happy to have this question be an extended one, because I think there's some fantastic ways that your poetics manage scale.
Yeah, I really love this question because I think when in the making of the book, I wasn't necessarily thinking like I'm managing scale, I'm managing structure. Well, maybe structure, because it's not a book where all of so a lot of poems in a lot of poetry books you have disconnected poems, right? Maybe there's a connection, but you can kind of move them around and you have to figure out the arc or not. And so I have some of that in there, but I also have, as you call, this poem that really is in the epic tradition, and which was written at different points in time across like 5 years, just not in sequence. And so there was a lot of managing in terms of what will go where, what should be the beginning, how should this end. And so in terms of structure, that's something that I was kind of sitting with. And in terms of scale, really, it's huge to think about a history like this and to put it alongside my own contemporary musings and, my trying to find myself in the world as a Black woman from the Caribbean, from Trinidad, who moved to New York at a young age, and also constantly moving back and forth and moving between all of these different spaces. So I think I was working through all of that and really wanting to be careful with the histories, really wanting to have a kind of ethics about it, really wanting to make sure that I paid attention to those nuances there. And so, in terms of that and in terms of the history, that's something that I hope showed up really. My head is spinning because I'm trying to think, there's so much here when, we're thinking about something like the scale, but I tried to manage the chronology, I tried to manage different registers, and I tried to hopefully echo what so many of us are walking around with inside of us, right? Like carrying these stories, carrying these resistances, carrying people that we've lost, people who sacrifice themselves along the way. All of these things are sitting within us when we're in a classroom, when we're at work, when we're crossing the streets. And it was important for me to put all of those things together and to try to wrestle with that and with that scale in some way.
Do you mind if I extend this question a little bit? I so love the response. And I realized as you were thinking through the question, even in your use of the word wrestle in that last bit you just said, that I used the word manage in scale, and I don't mind that word, but I think it's more than just a management, right? It's a inhabiting, it's a deploying, it's a being accountable to, it's sitting with the overwhelming impossibility of the scale of the history as you just registered. And so to just make clear to folks in the audience, both here and online, the structure of the book, you talked about the voice of the sea woman that runs on the bottom in italics, and in some way that's a deployment of scale where you have this singular voice that's talking as the whole gravity of the sea. And then you have the epic poem in the first half, and then, as you say, the poems in the second half, which have this largely the figure of a Black girl trying to reckon with being a diasporic subject. I think it's so fantastic. I think that those kinds of moves. I think there are other poetics. I think there are ways if you. this is such an embarrassing thing to do, but it's a fan thing to do, not it's done out of just pure appreciation of the work, not out of arrogance or anything. The ways that I experience you using adjectives and verbs on the first page, stewed and camouflaged and soldiers. And those three words, which you make in the context, if someone has the book, you make them do both historic and yet very specific, intimate work. And there's so many moments in this book where I, as a reader, as a lover, as a critic, I'm just astonished by the poetics, which I don't mean anything of intention. I simply mean that there is a rhythm and a deliberateness to trying to attend to as many dimensions of the thing. And it feels like, if I can, the last of the section that you read from the first poem, that long bit that starts, what smoke, what threadbare cry, the way you use that word what, the relative pronoun there, which means both a question but also an assertion, like that smoke, that threadbare cry. Whew.
Oh, wow. I love this. Like, I could listen to you talk all day.
Don't encourage me, but I think it's part of when I asked the question, I said managing. Maybe there's a way in which that word, I didn't mean it to close down on just the vastness of your poetics, and maybe even the way in which sound becomes a part of your poetics. So maybe would you say something about sound? One of the last poems you read was a poem about dub, and it had the two sides. Will you say something about how the particularity of maybe music and musics in the plural as being a part of your poetry practice?
So, I mean, just from I would say, the genesis of a poem. And when I'm writing a poem, I'm not thinking the genesis of a poem, but it feels a lot more rough than that. But one of the things that I need to do, I need to speak the poems out loud, and there's something about the ear that will tell you the direction where the poem should go. More or less. There are sometimes you have to, often you have to go back and then correct that, but really that sound is there from the beginning, which is one of the reasons why I can't work at like a cafe or something like that, because I don't want to disturb people around me, right? Because I'm just like calling out these lines of poems. But in terms of, I feel like music is all over this book. And that's because first of all, music has been something that reminds me of where I come from. And it helps me to learn often where I'm going. With that poem, Woman in Dub, I was listening to a lot of dub music, listening to Augustus Pablo, a lot of stuff, and also thinking about the tradition of the Jamaican dub poets as well. And for myself, I wanted to try to emulate that structure of dub music. And so, we have a lot of poems that are written in various forms. We have the villanelle, we have the sestina, X, Y, and Z. And so I thought, well, yes, there is also this sort of form of dub poetry that exists. And I wanted to create a form that tries to mirror the sound, the sonics of dub music. So the echoes, the reverbs, the looping, and so actually that's one of the poems that I had the most fun writing, because it was me playing with the sound, and also knowing that there's a failure inherent in it. Like, I can never completely emulate that, but just the process of it, the act of doing it, gave me so much pleasure. And so, you know, I'm really grateful for that sitting with the music and sitting in the dub there. Also, of course, I have to like shout out soca music and calypso being a part of that. In regards to the C voice, dancehall music really instructing how I wanted to infuse that C voice with personality, with a sense of bravado, with what I see as a standing up to in the face of immense power. And, you know, this kind of like, I know who I am, nobody go tell me, you know, what I'm about. And so I was, you know, thinking of Patra and thinking of Megan Thee Stallion, you know, to think about hip hop. These are the influences that I sat with as I was crafting that C voice. You know, this voice who comments on everything that's happening around, this voice that comments on the body, but also on the pollution of the seas, on the blood that was, you know, that was spilled on the seas, all of these things going into that. And so, in a way, the sound, the sonics, the music are ways of tying all of those things together. It's like the glue, really. And really allow me to collect and present this into a cohesive whole.
I promise that I won't keep going back to the specificity of your beautiful work, but Woman in Dub, you just said that one of the things for you is trying to create as much as possible the sense of reverb. This is the end of your poem, keeping the word reverbing in mind, which is one of the last words in the poem, and keeping in mind the B sound of reverbing. These are the words that resonate near the end of that poem. Heartbeat, belief, B-side, abolished, labor, black, burden, dub, body, reverbing. There's something for me as a reader there, you know, the first read that might be akin to what you're describing as the first writing, which is not necessarily a conscious or deliberate looking for a poetics. And then there's something about reading out loud and being like, oh my goodness, look at all those B sounds that are at once hitting with a certain sharpness, repeating, doing precisely, I think, what your aesthetic, what your ethic wants to render. Not just the sonic quality, but the wave of the ocean and what indeed all that water means in its complexity, its capacity to carry brutality, but also to just be a part of one of the elements on the earth. It is really something, and I promise I won't continue in that way. But as you can see, the book is beautifully dog-eared because there's such incredible things happening in it. Maybe I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll see if people in the audience have questions or if people online have questions. Though I just want to keep I just want to keep asking you about poems and then telling you things that I found in them, which may or may not be the things that were there, but are the things that are precious to me. Will you say something about poets who inspire you, whether in a deliberate way in this work, or just in the world of your making as both a poet and and a fiction writer. Certainly there's some poets that came to mind as I was reading, but I'd love to hear you talk about poets who inspire you.
Yeah, well, I absolutely have to name Emma Bessie Phillip for sure. And we were chatting about her just before the talk. And wow. I mean, there's so much. I know, like, I guess I'm supposed to, like, respond with a list, right? But I really need to pause there because when I first encountered her book, She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks. So I did my undergrad at Georgetown, and, you know, coming from, like, a Caribbean enclave in Queens, and then being at Georgetown, and you know, that encompasses so much, right? And being in a Caribbean poetry class with the poet Mark McMorris, and that being one of the texts that we encountered. And I didn't really, you know, there was so much that was going on. There was so much innovation, so much experimentation on the page. And I was so new to poetry that I couldn't really, I don't think I fully understood all of the all of the forms that were occurring on the page. But I felt like I know this poet. I know what is being said. There was something about the language, about the disruption of the language that really spoke to me. And so poems like Discourse on the Logic of Language, I was like, okay, so this is what I've been feeling. Like, I didn't know. I didn't know until, like, I didn't know how to articulate that and articulate the sense of, like, being, you know, like she talks about how it is so dangerous for a plant to be uprooted and then to be transplanted and then replanted. And I was like, okay, I think this is what I've been feeling. And so, yes, all the flowers to Emma Bessie Phillip. Also, again, like, just disrupting the white space on the page and writing in the margins, writing wherever you need to write, actually. Disrespecting the white space, really. I think that's something that I felt was really instructive while reading that text. I've also really been inspired by Kamau Brathwaite, by Walcott, by Lorna Goodison, by so many poets. Aracelis Girmay. Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. And Aracelis, because of what she does on the page, but also because of the way that she shows up in the world and her care, her way of being a poet, and just being a remarkable human being, and that being reflected in her poetics, but also, you know, both informing each other. And so that's something that I absolutely look up to. Poets like R. Erica Doyle as well. Mahmoud Darwish, the great Palestinian poet, actually had a huge influence on this book, and thinking about the epic, and thinking about exile, and thinking about the scale, actually, because I've been really so honestly in love with the way in which he deals with history, with genocide, with settler colonialism, but then also talking about his father and saying, like, why is it that you can't relate to me in this way, right? Like, is it because of these soldiers who are, like, standing outside the door? Like, is it because you have witnessed these atrocities? Like, you know, well, then take care of the stads. And so that's something that I've been incredibly moved by. And I feel like I can sit here all day listing and just paying tribute, really, because I feel really lucky to have these works and to have these words with me. And I just hope that I can, do them justice as I show up to the page.
I'm so grateful for your extended engagement with Norbesi Phillips's work, in particular that essay, The Absence of Writing, or How I Almost Became a Spy, that's in that book. And your own poem, which violates, right, the normative spacing on the page, that deploys that. And to hear you call Araceli Grimai's name too, that there's something in your own, at the very beginning you talked about your interest in the psycho-spiritual. And there are these moments in your work that are prayerful, that remind me not only of Grimai, who can do such incredible, expansive thought in 3 short lines. Or for me, the iconic poet Lucille Clifton, who there's a poem of yours that I think speaks with Clifton's imagining of the world of things. So I'm just grateful for what you've said, and also I would want to note your commitment to thinking about how you want to be as a poet, not only simply wanting to be a poet. I think. I hope that other people are hearing that as inspiration, but also as an articulation of something that you're trying to have fidelity to. I think that's beautiful. I could do this, right? I could do this. I'm so grateful to do this. Let me pause and see if there are questions that people have in the audience, if people want to ask the poet a question. We have a microphone set up here so folks online could hear it.
No pressure.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, you spoke about in Professor Bo's class there being a visual. Oh, thank you so much. You spoke about in Professor Bo's class there being a visual element to the class on Haiti. Could you speak about the process of the book as art object, the cover art, the color, the purple color of the back, like what it meant to produce, and maybe how much influence you had on the art selection and it as art object too.
Thank you, Allison. So, so many layers, right? I'm thinking of some of the works that I encountered in that class, and that initial piece that I wrote, which all of it isn't here. Sometimes you have to kind of leave the initial kernel, really. But there was a painting, I think by perhaps Hippolyte, that showed La Sirène with a trumpet, and that's something that I wanted to render in one of the poems. So when I say trumpet and fish and the nipple becoming an eye, that actually is ekphrasis. That is me looking at that painting, and I had to alter it once I realized where I was going with the longer poem. But that really is directly coming from that painting. And then the visual has always been a part of this process. So with the sea voice, I was really inspired by Wangechi Mutu, the Kenyan artist. First of all, like the sense of, or the process of collage, I thought gave me a kind of a structure, like, and to manage the scale as well. With what to put where, how to overlap, how to layer. And then there's also a painting or a collage painting, mixed media work of hers called Beneath Lies the Power. And it's this really striking image of 2 figures, one above water, one below. The figure above has these like bright, colorful birds in its hair, maybe a twig. The figure below is black. It looks almost like it's been in an oil spill. It has like a tail, and it has this sort of, I would say, monstrous look about it. But that title, Beneath Lies the Power, resonated with me. And so I thought about that as I was crafting the Sea Voice and thinking about where to position it, and thinking that it's in the margins at the bottom of the book, and thinking about people who are marginalized as well, and the immense energy and power that exists within us. And then also, of course, the cover really, so the cover of the book is an artwork by the Jamaican Trinidadian artist Andrea Chung, who is really fantastic in the work that she's doing. And this comes from a series called the Vex series. So she looked at a lot of photographs that were taken, perhaps maybe in the 1800s, I think mostly. And she noticed that in a lot of these photos, the people did not look like they wanted to be in these photos. And these photographs often became postcards. Sometimes, someone who was visiting a particular colony would send it back. And so, these, I guess, the subjects of these photographs were like doubly objectified, right? And so she really, I think, extracted that photograph. This particular one is of a woman who was in Brazil. So an enslaved African woman who lived and worked and was enslaved in Brazil. And she sort of, I guess, put a kind of blessing on it, I suppose, is how she thought about it, right? Maybe like just expelling those atrocities. And so there are different elements that she talks about that go into this. And I won't go into all of the meaning here, but it was interesting. A friend connected us, and I just explained a little bit about the book, and she was like, okay, this is the one, right? And it's amazing how it connected with the content of the book, thinking about, I look at this and I see Yemaya, I see Oshu, and I see aspects that are meant to bring protection to the person who is wearing it, but also the idea of a vex. The series is called Vex, of a vex face. And if you're from the Caribbean, if you're vexed, you are enraged, you're angry, but also this is an emotion that's not really afforded to Black women, right? To be vexed. You are penalized, great harm can come to you and to your body if you show and walk around with a vex face. And so all of these things here, and so in a way I'm really indebted to visual art and how it informs my practice and how it helps me think of where I'm going next.
Are there other questions? Maybe I can follow up. One of the things about Chung's series, the Vex series, it always makes me think too about the relationship between the vexed subject, the subject who's exhibiting that, and the idea of a hex.
Ooh, yes.
And part of why I'm thinking about that is what you just articulated, right? The sense of not just the process of reclaiming these images, but the sense of being able to appreciate the figures as representations of human beings who might have been trying to refuse or resist a particular thing. I think about the poem by Dion Brand's Blues Spiritual for Mammy Prater, which is, since you're talking a lot about visual images, and I want to ask you about the ekphrastic as a practice, because you seem to be very indebted to that. But that poem, too, is a poem that's looking on an image of a black woman seemingly photographed against her will, and the speaker in the poem is trying to read and understand something other than the subjection that the photograph might be. And I felt there was a resonance for me when I saw this image. I was like, oh, it's the vex hex. It's the it's the potency of that kind of energy. And so I love this as a cover and appreciate the response you gave. Will you say something about ekphraxis, that idea of the poet being called? Poetry is, of course, a rendering in words the visual, and as the question earlier reminded us too, that poems also live on the page as visual art, right? They need to be spoken aloud, but they also have line breaks and shape particularities. But you seem also especially interested in looking at visual art and then also thinking with it and rendering it as a poem. Will you say something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I just love vex hex. Like, I'm gonna carry that phrase around.
We need to have a longer conversation and just we could. I'm offering myself to go on the road with you. I make a good help.
Oh my God. Wow. Well, speaking about the vex hex, I think when I thought about how I want to show up in the world and how I want this book to show up, one of the thoughts was like, I want this to be a hex, a curse, right? And so like a kind of chanting down. So that's definitely, I think that's why I'm thinking, okay, this is a phrase I'm going to hold on to. With the ekphrasis, so one of the like beautiful things about poems is that they are yours and you can really make them, you can have fun with them. And sometimes a lot of people who are writing may not realize this. They may think, well, it needs to adhere to a particular structure. And I'm like, it's poetry, especially given the industry of poetry. You might as well just do what you want, okay? So, but I see paintings, visual art as another layer to kind of understand the self. And then that talking back to the painting is another way, again, to have a conversation. So there's a poem in here called First American Years where I mention Chris O'Feely's, I think it's Holy Virgin Mary. I think that's the title of the work. And that's a work that I remember because when I moved from Trinidad to New York, there was so much that I was learning through the news, learning about this new place that I'm in. Of course, I was seeing a lot of police brutality. And so that was something that struck me as a child, seeing, first of all, the NYPD, right? Like involved in these killings of Black people. And that was incredibly confusing for me as a child. Like, what is this? Where did my parents bring me to? And I couldn't really articulate that at the time, right? I didn't know that I was experiencing that. But one of the things that also sort of marked that time for me was seeing this big uproar around this painting on the news because the mayor at the time, Giuliani, right, was really upset that this painting was showcased at the Brooklyn Museum. And he was upset because he said he just kept talking about the elephant dung. So this painting is composed of elephant dung, of glitter, of many other aspects. And the overall effect is a Virgin Mary that is a Black woman. And he, in his own writing about the painting, he mentioned that elephant dung being an impulse or a move of respect, actually, right? And he spoke about like a particular culture where this material was one of reverence, right? But Giuliani wasn't hearing that. So that was like what was happening at the time. And so I wanted to sort of pull that as a kind of a capsule of like, these are the things that are happening there that helped me to make sense of that moment, right? And even still, I'm like, can I even still make sense of this? Do I even fully understand that moment and these moments that are still happening, that are ongoing? I don't know, but I do think me working with visual art helps me to kind of to put things into perspective in a way, and helps me with my articulation.
I sense it too as another navigation and inhabiting of scale, because it's another language that you're entering as a poet. And then in that particular case with the Ophelia image, it also allows the speaker in that poem to be in touch with a history of a time when there was both amongst artists of color, amongst minority artists, amongst queer artists, this kind of vibrant activist project of making disturbing and unsettling art. And so the speaker, one of the reasons I'm mentioning this is that when people read the poem, the speaker is this young girl who's trying to figure out dislocation in the world, and is touching all of these kinds of scenes. That feels to me like a young girl in the cosmos of a world, and trying to figure out where are the stars, where are the places I'm going to land. And so I read it as another scalar moment in the work. I'm supposed to, at this point, ask if there are any questions from online. Allie? This is Allie LaForge, who's a PhD student here at Brown, who's helping with today's event. And
hi, nice to meet you. So we didn't actually have any questions from the live stream, but if it's okay, I'd love to ask a question. Awesome. So thank you so much for this incredible conversation. Like Professor Kwashi, I was really struck by how this project came out of a course with Professor Bogues. And, as a graduate student myself, I'm always thinking about how different creative projects can be created in the academy. And I'm also interested in the ways that you presented history as a way of thinking about today in the present moment and working towards freedom specifically. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to how you see poetry, your poetry more broadly, in relationship to academic knowledge production, and how you think your work offers alternative ways into analyzing history and power, and maybe speak to some of the sources that you draw from in thinking about history, not just written, but like oral, audiovisual, otherwise, because you present such incredible imagery in your poems. And I was wondering if there were specific sources or even stories that you drew from to create those images. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I guess the first part of the question, in thinking about like the poem's relationship to academic knowledge production, interestingly enough, I think of it almost as like another kind of ekphrasis. And so so it's a way for me to incorporate the things that I'm moved by. And so there's a poem in the book where I mentioned that the thinking of the poem comes out of Catherine McKittrick's cartographies of struggle, and so or demonic ground, and so that's like a very literal way that I think I'm working with scholarship. Although one of the things is that incorporating history into this text was like a huge dilemma for me, because at many times I felt like working with history kind of weighed down the creative process of it. And so while looking through the Black codes of Haiti, while looking at other elements, looking through all of these texts, I I went to a conference, this great conference called the Maroon Conference in Jamaica, too, that I think also put me in conversation with a lot of amazing people who are thinking about the Haitian Revolution, thinking about many different aspects of the Black Atlantic. And I had to sort of pull back and, again, think about scale, think about managing, think about, am I, like, do I want to create another text of history, or do I want to create a work of poetry with all of the allowances that poetry can offer? And so I had to sort of tell myself, it's okay, like, because I think sometimes we have this feeling like we want to show people that we did the homework, that that I understand what I'm talking about. But I said, let me trust whoever encounters this book, and let me pull back. So there's a lot of stuff that has been taken out, actually. A lot of references to people, to places that has been taken out, really so that the lyric can stand. So there is that. And then the second part of your question, I'm trying to pick it up. I think... Okay, yes, and so along that, sources, of course, so I was looking at a lot of secondary sources. So, of course, and now I'm talking about the first half of the book. So, really a lot of texts, the Black Jacobins, Caroline Ethick's The Making of Haiti, Revolution from Below, actually was really instructive for me. Just, again, because I wanted to not think about the major or like the main, the well-studied figures of the Haitian Revolution, but to think about someone who has been rendered nameless, right? Someone that we will not know of. And so that gave me a sense of like what was happening sort of outside of the major movements. And then actually, I feel like I have to name dance as a source. And so because this part of the project felt incredibly heavy, like spiritually heavy, I was like, I need to move my body in some kind of way. And so I actually started doing a lot of like Caribbean, like traditional Caribbean dances. And so one of those dance classes that I went to was a Haitian dance class. And it was so amazing to me, like how much storytelling is maintained and carried forward through these dances, the different aspects of either a loi or of thinking of a historical moment, thinking of the onset, the start of the revolution. There are dances where, the dancer is meant to like drive that knife into the black pig. And I was like, wow, this is not something, someone who is not aware of this art form and this world will think about. So, and this is something that I was trying to get at, actually, right? Like a kind of resonance that exists outside of a text, outside of like of like an official kind of source or document, something that's oral, something that lives in the body as well, something that perhaps has been passed down. Because even within myself and with this book, there are some things, perhaps a family member talking about, my great-grandmother used to like draw something that looked like a veve on the wall, like what's that about? So privileging that oral history, the history of the body as well, has been instructive for me.
I'm so glad you brought us to the specificity of the body and the capaciousness of the body, because one of the unasked questions was about the way in which the erotic and I don't just mean, I mean the erotic in the Lordian sense, right? How much sex and touch and sensibility and feel, all of which are kind of intelligence, radiates through your poems. So I'm really happy to hear you give the specific example of dance, and to remind us, as scholars of slavery has shown us, is that we have to also remember that the people who were enslaved had full lives of full practices of movement and art and being that escapes the totalitarian and brutal gesture that slavery is. When I say gesture, I don't mean a diminishment. I mean, I hope people understand the particular way in which I'm using that word. And so just your use of erotics throughout the work. The C voice on the bottom of the page is an erotic because it's doing its own kind of rhythmic moving with and against the text. It's a stunning work. If I can praise one more poem and then maybe ask you as we close this part of the event, I want to ask you what you were thinking about and working on next. But in response to Ali's question, you have a poem in here titled Harriet Jacobs Grips the Silence. And it's one of the first person pronoun I is prominent as a voice gesture in many of your poems. And yet in this poem, it's the object pronoun me. The first line is disappear me, which is a brilliant syntax because the speaker uses the kind of vernacular or demotic as a way to speak in remove. It is a beautiful, you use the pronoun me so brilliantly in this poem. Again, not in any kind of way that's conscious, but in a sense of really trying to be with and think with the particular aesthetics of subjection and creativity that we know of Jacobs's life. And I just want to tell you, as I was thinking about Ali's question about research, and your sense of saying that you, of course, love the research, but wanted to also make sure that you could contribute something as a poet. You've done it. You've done it. It's a magnificent book. Will you tell us what you're thinking about now, what you're working on? I know this book is new, but I also know that you have a practice as a writer in many genres, as a teacher, etc. What are you working on now?
Well, first and foremost, rest.
That's a work.
It really is. It's hard work.
Yes.
It's actually really hard to remind yourself to rest and to take a break and to pause. So that's something that I keep having to remind myself to do, really. But right now, because I think there's a lot of activity around the book and readings and all of that, and so I think about that too as something that I'm working on. I've been working on this book for about 5 years off and on, while teaching, while figuring out how am I going to make this thing happen? Is it going to happen? And so this is a beautiful time to be in conversation with people, to be in community, after so much solitude, really, and so much, I guess, not really being able to speak about the thing that had been so alive within my head. So I'm really just enjoying this moment and coming out and having conversations. But also, I'll just say I'm thinking a lot about about Black people's relationship to land, to sea, to climate change. I think I'm maybe moving even more towards the Caribbean and how I'm thinking about erosion, and the particular erosion that's happening near like my parents' home. So these are the things that I'm really immersed in at this moment, but I'm also just doing a lot of listening. So I'm writing things here and there. I'm also thinking about what a kind of transnational, sort of borderless kind of solidarity maybe, but also thinking across these borders might look like. And I'm just figuring it out. Yeah.
That's a work too. Because I want to end with what I want to say to you, I'll say to the audience here with us that we have a brief coffee break between now and until 4 o'clock, when we'll then have the keynote lecture by Professor Marcus Rediker. But what I most want to say, my dear, is first, thank you. Thank you not only for this book, but for the manner in which you inhabit being a poet, being a writer. Thank you for being so generous with us today. The work you have done and the work you are doing now, including the work of resting and being of care, is work that is important to all of us. So thank you. This book, What Noise Against the Cane, what a book, and what a person you are. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your work. Please help me thank Desiree.
Well, thank you for coming back, and particularly those of you who are online, to say thanks for rejoining us. And to add my personal thanks to Desiree Bailey and Professor Kevin Quashie for a really extraordinary conversation. Thank you both. Let me introduce Marcus Rediker, who will be coming to us virtually. Professor Marcus Rediker is the Distinguished Professor of Atlantic History at the University of Pittsburgh. His Histories from Below have won numerous awards, including the George Washington Book Prize, and have been translated into 17 languages worldwide. He is the author of the really very, very important text, The Slave Ship, A Human History, 2007, and The Amistad Rebellion, An Atlantic Odyssey of Slavery and Freedom in 2012, which was the basis for his prize-winning documentary, Ghost of Amistad, directed by Tony Buba. He's currently working as a guest curator at the Turner Gallery in Tate Britain, and writing a book about escaping slavery by sea in the antebellum America, on which this lecture is based. I'd want to say that in choosing Professor Rediker to give this opening keynote lecture for the series that inaugurates the 10th anniversary, the choice was actually fairly easy. Professor Rediker has been a close friend of the center from its inception, always supportive of the work of the center, and he has also been a intellectual friend of myself and the kind of historical work that I attempt to do. And when I was becoming director of the center, he actually encouraged me to take up this position. So it is with really great pleasure and honor that I ask Professor Rediker to speak to us this afternoon. Marcus, all yours.
I have a special feeling for Brown University and for the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice I thought years ago that the courage that Brown had shown in facing its past would be exemplary, and now, years later, we find other universities trying to do the same thing. So, congratulations to you, Tony, to Shana, to all the colleagues who have really built a first-rate institution. It's tremendously impressive what you have accomplished. In speaking today, I want to begin by acknowledging that yesterday we lost a brilliant scholar, Julius Scott, the author of a book entitled The Common Wind, about the circulation of the news of the Haitian Revolution. I'm sure all of you know it. Julius was a friend of mine, and I would like to dedicate this lecture to him. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Oops. Okay, there's my title, Maritime Frontier of Freedom, Escaping Slavery by Sea in Antebellum America. And I thought I would begin just by saying something about the peculiar origin of this book. It actually goes back to the late 1980s when I was working with my friend and comrade Peter Linebaugh on a book called The Many-Headed Hydra. And I was reading advertisements for people who had escaped slavery. And I noticed a theme in a great many of these ads. And this was a refrain. Frequently, the last sentence in these advertisements in port city newspapers, said, "Masters of vessels are warned not to take this person on board, and if you do, you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Now, other ads gave similar sorts of clues. The runaway was last seen in the company of sailors. The fugitive was last seen heading toward the docks. The fugitive knows the work of the sea. That's another and very telling comment. So in 1990, having done this work, I gave a lecture. I think it was the American Society of 18th Century Studies, and it had the same title as today's lecture, The Maritime Frontier of Freedom. But as it happened, I ended up dropping the topic. The Many-Headed Hydra grew to a monstrous length of almost 2,000 pages, and a lot of things were cut out of it, and that included this work on this these maritime circuits of escape. But here I am now, more than 30 years later, coming back to it. I've written some books about the struggle against slavery at sea. That was actually the subject of a lecture I gave very early in the history of the center about the Amistad Rebellion. So now I'm writing this book about maritime runaways from roughly 1830 to the coming of the Civil War. So let me say a word about the historiography of slavery in the beginning. I would argue that the scholarship that has been created about slavery and resistance to slavery over the last 50 years is probably the best body of scholarship on any subject anywhere in the world. And for that body of scholarship, we have the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement to thank. Because these movements were the engine demanding a new kind of history that took race and slavery seriously in the United States and around the world. So now here's a mystery. A lot of that high quality scholarship is about the so-called Underground Railroad, the networks by which people emancipated themselves by getting to the north and to some freer place. What's really kind of curious about all this is that A huge number of these people escaped by sea, and yet there has been very little work on that subject. And that is actually a mystery that I want to return to at the end of this talk. Why has there been so little work on this? Now, since I started this investigation 30 plus years ago, there has been some important work that's been done. I would mention 3 books in particular, work by David Soselsky on black maritime labor and escape in North Carolina. Excellent work by Cassandra Newby Alexander about Norfolk and the Chesapeake Bay, Hampton Roads area. Norfolk was really probably the leading site for the escape of slavery by sea. And then finally, a very new book published only a few months ago edited by Tim Walker, called Sailing to Freedom, published by UMass Press. So it's my goal to build on, add to, and extend these important foundational works as I move forward. Let me mention at the outset 2 themes that I think link this work to the present. First of all, let me quote a runaway man by the name of Henry Bibb, who in 1853 had this to say. He said, quote, self-emancipation is now the order of the day, end quote. Now, what he meant by that was that abolitionism happens from below, with resistance from below. And this has actually become an extremely important theme in the study of bondage in recent years. My last 2 books have been about this theme. First, as I mentioned, on the Amistad Rebellion. And secondly, a book about a man named Benjamin Lay, the fearless Benjamin Lay, a radical Quaker abolitionist, a working class man who in the 1730s demanded a total and immediate abolition of slavery. So both of these are works about what I would call abolition from below. That's one theme. The second theme is that thinking about escaping slavery by sea is very significant in light of today's migrant solidarity movements. So I see this escape as a 19th century precursor, a kind of sanctuary movement for mobile fugitives. Okay, so let me sketch out the context for escape by sea, and let's begin with the grandest level of context, the Atlantic context and the global context. Slavery in the United States, as everyone knows, was part of a massive slave system, an Atlantic slave system. That in turn was a constituent part of global capitalism as it developed from the late 16th century forward. In 1830, there were roughly 2 million enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, the number had grown to 4 million. It had doubled. Tobacco, rice, cotton, especially cotton, links to the Industrial Revolution, whose cutting edge was textiles. Now, for a very long time, thanks to the various departments of economic mythology around the country, and with an assist from Eugene Genovese, people argued that slavery was a non-capitalist social formation. Well, C.L.R. James said long ago that that wasn't true, and I think James has decisively won that argument. We now understand better than ever that the system of slavery was absolutely critical to the rise of global capitalism. So my story actually begins, I'd say in 1829. There we go. In 1829, with the publication of a pamphlet by a man named David Walker. David Walker's Appeal, as it's called. I'm sure all of you know it. This was a revolutionary proclamation in which Walker wanted the enslaved people of the Western Hemisphere to follow the example of Haiti and to rise up in armed rebellion. This is all very well known. This is quite rightly a famous text. What is less well known is that this was a product of struggles on the waterfront. David Walker was himself a man of the docks. He owned a store on the waterfront in Boston. He sold slops or clothes to sailors. And what he would do frequently is to take his pamphlet and sew it into the clothing of sailors, actually black sailors and white sailors, who would then carry the copies into southern ports as they sailed out of Boston. And lots of ships did that. Now, this pamphlet produced a massive reaction in the South. It absolutely terrified the ruling classes of the South, who did everything they could to block its circulation. But David Walker is important to me because the networks of distribution of his appeal is the mirror image of the networks by which enslaved people escaped by sea. So we're talking about maritime networks, things going in both directions. David Walker, in turn, inaugurates a massive cycle of rebellion in the 1830s. Nat Turner in 1831, the formation of William Lloyd Garrison's the Liberator in the same year. We have Sam Sharpe's rebellion in Jamaica. We have the Mali revolt in Brazil. We have in the background all the resistance surrounding British abolition, which takes place in two phases in 1834 and 1838. So this is a profound wave of resistance, and within this, self-emancipation, running away, acquires a new political valence. That, I think, is a very important thing. Now, I've got to pause and tell you about an unexpected discovery in the course of this research. These are the kinds of things you don't always expect. But in focusing on maritime circuits of escape in antebellum America, what I've discovered is that there are actually 4 distinct networks. There is a Gulf and Caribbean network, in which New Orleans and Mobile play an important role. There is a Great Lakes circuit, with people making their way to Canada. And then there is the huge riverine system of the Mississippi. These are all maritime circuits for escape. The one that I'm concentrating on is the Atlantic Circuit. That includes the southern ports, starting in the south, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina, Norfolk, Richmond, Baltimore, people escaping by sea, and then sailing to northern ports, primarily Philadelphia, New York, New Bedford, and Boston. Now, I've got evidence to suggest that in these 4 cities, which are by and large, by the way, the center of the growing abolitionist movement, most of the people who came by sea. They got off ships, a majority of them. And yet the historiography does not include this point. The Atlantic is the largest of the 4 circuits, home to the most important abolitionist organizations, so it occupies a strategic location within the struggle, we might say. So from the 1830s forward to the Civil War, what we have is the very well-known logic of polarization between North and South. Abolitionists increasingly affect the debate, as do the Southern nationalists, also called fire eaters. And within that debate, self-emancipated people are a source of constant friction, constant problems, actually far beyond their actual numbers. This is especially true after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And after that act is passed, a great many people in the free black communities of the northern ports and in the abolitionist communities, and there's a very large overlap between those two, decide that they will now break the law in their defiance of the slave power, as they call it. Okay, so that's kind of the big Atlantic global picture. Let's now talk about local context. A big part of this project is that I want to see the waterfront as a critically important place in its own right. It is a zone for the accumulation of capital, and it is a zone of struggle against the institution of slavery. These things go together. It's a rough place, the waterfront. Dangerous place, full of desperate people who come and go with the tides. So let me introduce a few of the players in this drama. Here we have the docks. This is actually an image of the docks on the East River in New York, and it's a work scene, as you can see. You can see people moving bales of cotton, porters, draymen, all the rest. Lots of dock workers, very crucial. Sailors are a very big part of this. Here's a group of 6 sailors, and even though the black sailor is depicted in a racist caricature, this still expresses a very important point, because black sailors were about 15 to 20% of all ships' crews in the antebellum era, which means that almost every ship that came from a northern port to a southern port had several black sailors aboard. This is a very important point. Now, here's an image of Frederick Douglass, who, as I'm sure most of you know, who escaped bondage in Baltimore, dressed as a sailor, using the sailor's protection certificate of a sailor that he knew, a black sailor that he knew. And this is Frederick Douglass's school. Frederick Douglass grew up in Baltimore, or didn't grow up, but lived much of his life in Baltimore and Fells Point on the waterfront. I don't know if you can see this, but he lived right around here on South Dallas Street, about 3 blocks from the waterfront. The waterfront is where he learned to read by watching shipwrights chalk letters onto different kinds of lumber as to where they went in the construction of a ship. So Frederick Douglass is very much a product of this maritime system of escape. This is an image actually drawn by an artist in Charleston in 1852, a man named Eyre Crow, who was traveling. And these are what he calls wharf hands. These are the black dock workers of Charleston. And in every port city, there will be a substantial number of black dock workers. This man in the lower right, something is written in vernacular by the artist. It says, "On the deck all the time, I didn't hear nothing." So that's a comment by one of these wharf hands. Another very important player are market women. Now, I want to give you actually an example of how this would work, how women like this played a role in this maritime system of escape. This actually is a painting by Thomas Waterman Wood of a woman in Baltimore in 1858. She would carry these vegetables, fresh vegetables, to the ships as they come in, because sailors have been at sea for a while. They're in need of this kind of nourishment. But here's a specific quotation from Boston, where an abolitionist wrote, "A colored woman would go aboard a ship with fresh fruit, pies, etc. She easily got aboard and found out if there was any fugitive on board, who would then be, quote, taken away by night." So this is a very important part of all this, a connection. So sailors, dock workers, market women, there are many others. There are artisans, there are day laborers, as I've said, porters, cartmen, draymen. This is the motley crew of the port city. It is multi-ethnic, it is international, and it is cosmopolitan. Now, these docks, as I've mentioned, are a strategic location in the circuits of global capitalism. The hinterlands would bring their commodities, hogsheads of tobacco, tierces of rice, bales of cotton, to the port city, which would then be loaded onto the ships, by the labor of the motley crew. These dock workers are especially important in all this. Excuse me. The commodity flow then allows these items to move into the world market. At the same time, other manufactured goods are coming into the American ports. These are also unloaded, moved, part of their value created by this motley crew of workers in the port city. So cooperation through the division of labor presents numerous opportunities for projects of self-emancipation. Okay, now let me just mention one other thing. I do want to mention that the docks are not an unchanging place. And one of the things that's going on in the 1840s and 1850s is that their social composition is changing with the arrival of massive amounts of poor Irish workers. So there is a conflict over jobs on the waterfront. We can get into that a little later if you like. So there's all this cooperation on the waterfront. That cooperation has to be policed. And this is one of the main concerns of the authorities of port cities and, in fact, of the state legislatures of the states, especially in the South. The policing that goes on the docks is extreme. We have guards, constables, customs officers, the watch. We also have in the northern ports what are called blackbirders, gangs of men who would capture free people of color, hustle them secretly aboard a ship to take them to the South to be sold into slavery, blackbirders. And there are also a tremendous number of slave catchers or bounty hunters. So this is a place of struggle. That's the point. A place of struggle. The forces of slavery and the forces of anti-slavery collide in these waterfronts of the port cities. Now, one of the major developments in all this, and this is something that goes on throughout the South, is that the fear of Black sailors coming into southern ports is extreme. They are considered to be revolutionary vectors. So beginning in South Carolina in 1822, a series of acts are passed. They're called the Negro Seaman Acts, which basically treats these Black sailors as if they are carrying disease. And the ruling classes thought of revolution as a disease. So they would be quarantined until the day before the ship was going to leave port so that they couldn't do things like give away copies of David Walker's appeal, or so that they couldn't smuggle people on board to carry them to the northern port. So this is a big part of the struggle over labor. Who will be able to work on these ships coming from the north to the southern ports? Okay, so there's a policing function, but there are also a number of countervailing forces in these ports that will help see people seeking emancipation to get on board these ships. Okay, first, captains who arrived in southern ports frequently needed labor for two reasons. One thing is that the sailors would frequently desert. Maybe they didn't like the captain. Maybe they thought they could get better wages. So desertion is a constant sort of thing. So you've got the interesting situation where sailors are running from the ship and runaways are running to it. So this is actually very important. Sickness and mortality will also increase the need for labor. And many of these captains would just ask no questions. Now, related to that is the fact that a huge number of enslaved people knew the work of the sea. This is one of the things that David Siselsky has written about very well. They worked on the waterfront. They had a lot of maritime skills, so they were valuable to these ship captains. So this is another reason they were willing to take them on. Now, a third point, by the 1850s, some ship captains were abolitionists. So they actually go to southern ports. There aren't a lot of them, but We have evidence for about 15 or 20, but they will actually go to the southern ports with the express desire to bring runaways back to the northern port where their voyage originated. So that's a third kind of countervailing force. A fourth is the motley crew itself, the sympathetic dockers, the sailors. Some of these people are abolitionists, some of them are not, but they are very frequently willing to assist runaways, to stow themselves, to hide themselves on board the ship without the knowledge of the officers, especially the captain. And I would say that an especially important figure in the motley crew is the person who is called the black cook. Many of the cooks on board the ships were African American, and they played an outsized role in smuggling people on board these vessels. And then the fifth countervailing force are the free black communities, north and south, many of whose members work along the waterfront. So these free black communities are in a position to anchor these networks. There are many of them waterfront workers, and therefore they know a tremendous amount about the coming and going of ships. Okay, so my concluding point here basically is that capital organizes cooperative labor. This is very clear. One of the big things that merchants had to do in these port cities was organize a complex division of labor to move all of these commodities in order to accumulate capital in the world market. But once that cooperation is organized, the people who have been brought into cooperative relationships with each other can choose to develop projects of their own. They are not limited to doing only what the capitalists want them to do. So my argument is that out of the labor processes of the port cities grows this extraordinarily important system of maritime escape. Okay, so let me tell you how it worked. Let's talk now about how the maritime system actually worked. And I want to give you a specific example. Let me begin by introducing to you a man named William Powell. William Powell was born to an enslaved African American man and a free Native American woman in upstate New York. He went to sea. He sailed the seas. He sailed all around the Atlantic. He sailed to Brazil. He went on a whaling voyage of about 2 years in length. He became a seasoned sailor. He was a man of the sea. And he imbibed the traditions of solidarity at sea. He left the sea in 1832 in New Bedford, where he opened a boarding house for Black sailors. Now, this is actually a very important institution. In 1839, he moved to New York and opened a colored sailors' home there, a boarding home. This was on the East River on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and this place becomes a vortex of subversive international information. And here I want to remember Julia Scott. This is a place where the common wind blew fiercely, where the news of different struggles around the Atlantic would circulate. Very important. It became, the colored sailors' boarding house became a hothouse of abolitionist organizing, a place where runaways could be hid. It would be brought directly off of the ships by these sailors. But it also became a place of labor organizing. This is very significant. William Powell was a leader in this movement. When he went actually to Liverpool for a few years in the 1850s, the man who took over running the sailors' home was another African-American abolitionist named Albro Lyons. And I actually found a card here. Lyons also ran a store like David Walker selling clothes to sailors. but he also ran, as I've said, the boarding home. But you can sort of get a sense here of the way in which this boarding home was kind of one part a union hall and one part an inn for travelers, wages collected, the best of shipping procured for seamen. William Powell actually came back from Liverpool. He was involved in this kind of work with the Colored Sailors Boarding Home for more than 30 years. And I should mention, by the way, that the very first seafaring trade union in the United States, the very first, was organized at the Colored Sailors Boarding House in 1863. So this gives you an idea about William Powell. And I might also just add, William Powell is really deserves to be better known. One of the reasons why he's not very well known is because he didn't write any books, he didn't leave any papers, but I've discovered that he was a vigorous correspondent in a variety of abolitionist newspapers. So I found about 200 articles that William Powell wrote. He is a tremendous, what I would call rank and file leader of the abolition movement and someone who plays a very important role. Okay, so that's William Powell. Now, June 27, 1847, a Brazilian ship called the Lembrança docks on the East River at the bottom of Roosevelt Street, about 2 blocks away from William Powell and the Colored Sailors' home. Black dock workers go aboard this ship, Lembrança, to unload coffee. And what they discover is that there are 3 enslaved people on board the ship. There are 2 men, 1 sailor and 1 cook, and 1 woman, a maid who cared for the wife and the children of the captain. Well, one of these dock workers goes running to William Powell and says, "We've got some people on this ship." And of course, slavery had been abolished in New York 20 years earlier in 1827. So these people are technically free once they come there. It's the free water doctrine, not the free soil doctrine. So William Powell jumps into action. He dresses up as a merchant. He walks down to the docks and walks right aboard the ship, pretending to be the merchant to whom the coffee was being consigned. So now let's remember too, this guy was a sailor. He knows his way around ships. So he walks around looking at this, looking at the coffee, inspecting the ship, doing this and that. And then he sees one of these enslaved African men. And he walks up to him and he asks him in Portuguese, "Are you a slave?" Now, William Powell had sailed to Brazil. He'd spent time in Brazil. The motley crew is very cosmopolitan. He speaks to the man in Portuguese. The man's answer is, "Yes, I am a slave," to which William Powell says, "You are no longer a slave. You will be free before sunset." And then he leaves the ship. Meanwhile, the news of this ship has begun to circulate along the docks. So there's a growing crowd of Black workers assembling at this Roosevelt Street wharf. Abolitionists, Black and white abolitionists, began to join the crowd. They're probably contemplating an armed rescue, which is very common in these days and very much an important part of the vigilance societies, these very radical abolitionist groups. The one in New York had been formed in 1835. So this crowd is basically gathered to signal their interest in these people aboard the ship. And William Powell, meanwhile, goes to another African-American man named Louis Napoleon, who was a porter, another dock worker, who had played a key role for many years in assisting fugitives in New York. And he suggested Louis Napoleon go to a judge and get a writ of habeas corpus. And lo and behold, only a few hours later, those 2 men and 1 woman were standing in front of a judge, and a legal struggle had begun. Now, the men, things then go back and forth a bit. This whole thing unfolds over a series of few weeks, but the men end up in the Eldridge Street Jail in New York. That's an important point, and I want to come back to that in a minute. Okay, now, turns out we're lucky. We're really lucky, or maybe it's actually not luck at all, but we can see how this encounter on that Brazilian ship looked, not only from the point of view of William Powell, but from the point of view of the African cook to whom William Powell spoke. That man's name is Mahama Gardo Bakwakwa, who was born in the city of Jugu, which is in present-day northern part of the Republic of Benin. He had been enslaved and shipped to Ouida in the kingdom of Dahomey. He made a middle passage to Pernambuco in Brazil, then went to Rio and was finally shipped by his enslaver aboard the Lembrança for New York. Now, it wasn't only the black dock workers in New York who knew that that state had abolished slavery, but Bakwakwa knew it too, as did the other people on board the ship. And he said, we were going to a happy place. We're going to a happy place. And he had already started to begin his plan to escape the vessel as soon as they got to New York. Okay, so he arrives. When he arrived, he only knew one word of English, as he says. He says that word was F-R-E-E, free, a word that had been taught to him by an English sailor on the voyage from Rio to New York. Now, Bakwakwa would go on to become an important abolitionist in his own right, penning the autobiography whose cover you see here in 1854. Okay, but now let's go back to the jail. Back to the jail. One morning, everybody woke up and the two fugitive men, the other woman, by the way, was taken, the other enslaved person, the woman was taken back to the ship. She was not in the jail at this time, but the two men one morning were missing. Nothing seemed unusual, but the cell in which they had locked was just empty. The whole city of New York was abuzz about this. Had they escaped? Was it a miracle? What had happened? It wasn't a miracle. It was simply the workings of a well-organized movement from below. And here's what happened, which I found out because William Powell wrote about it 30 years later. An abolitionist had been locked up in the Eldridge Street Jail for debt. And it was communicated to him that these two people who were now imprisoned were of great interest and that we must actually liberate them from the jail. So this abolitionist began a long drinking bout with the keeper of the prison, drank the man into a stupor, took his keys, opened the cell, opened the door, and out went these two men, including Bakwakwa, to a carriage with William Powell and several other abolitionists, who then carried them quickly to Boston, get them out of the city. There were a lot of slave catchers in New York. It was kind of a dangerous place. Boston abolitionists would then take over and complete what becomes an international circuit in this maritime system of escape. They placed the fugitives on board a vessel for Haiti, where they go, where they would then be well beyond the reach of any American slaveholders. Now, when Bakwakwa writes about this encounter in 1854 in his autobiography, he really did not understand what had happened and exactly how he had been freed. He didn't really understand it. Of course, he didn't speak any English, so he couldn't understand the legal proceedings, and he didn't really understand how he got out. Here's the way he explained it to himself. He described his good fortune by crediting God for, quote, raising up so many friends in a strange land, end quote. These friends were the people who opened the prison doors as the guards slept. And as it happens, I think friend is actually a good word for it, because William Powell and other abolitionists frequently called themselves the friend of the slaves. This is a language of solidarity and friendship. Okay, so let me summarize how this maritime escape works. Black abolitionist dock workers and a motley crew of sailors connected ships and wharves and freedom struggles over thousands of nautical miles, from Brazil to New York to Boston to Haiti, and eventually, in the case of Bakwaqa, on to Great Britain and eventually Canada. Okay, so there are other maritime circuits that are part of this extraordinary system. Okay, so let me conclude. And let's just talk about that mystery I mentioned at the outset. Why are runaways by sea so largely unknown? Well, some of it has to do with sources. There are a lot of maritime sources that many historians just don't know much about. But that is not a full answer to the question, because there are many, many sources about maritime escapes that are right there in the documents that historians have been reading for a very long time. For example, William Still's collection of accounts of people he assisted as part of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee as they escaped to Philadelphia. A majority of those people arrived by water, but there's relatively little commentary on that. A second reason why we don't know as much as we might is because the networks were secret, they were effective, and they were largely carried out by working class people who didn't leave the kinds of documentary evidence that the more middle class abolitionists did. My former student, Jesse Olsovsky, has written an outstanding forthcoming book on these vigilance committees, these frequently Black-led, very militant organizations in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, and in several other cities. And it is absolutely important that the linkages to workers are critical to the operation of these networks. And those people didn't leave many documents. So that's a second reason. But there's a third reason, and I do think this one accounts for quite a bit. The very metaphor Underground Railroad points us in the wrong direction. We're not talking about a railroad here. We're not talking about something underground. It was below decks. It was over the seas. It wasn't a railway. It was a sailway. Okay? Now, you might think this is just a matter of semantics, but I think it's much deeper than that. Because the truth is that there is a very deeply embedded bias in modern thinking that history happens on land in nation states. And therefore, history doesn't happen at sea. We've got these maps in our heads. I've actually named this bias. I call it terracentrism. We have all these terracentric and frequently nationalist historical narratives which deny that history happens at sea, but we know that race formation happened at sea, class formation happened at sea, freedom struggles happened at sea. All of these things are very important. The sea is a site of struggle, and I do believe that a lot of people have been blinded and unable to see the maritime component by this kind of instinctive bias, which is really all the more important for being uninspected. Okay, finally, the last question is, why does escaping by sea matter? I think there are two important reasons. First, it helps us to rethink what running away actually was. It helps us to think about running away as a social process. There has been a tendency, I think it's begun to change, but there's been a tendency to think of running away as an individualistic response to slavery. And it's been contrasted with the collectivist response of insurrection. But this maritime system of escape actually shows that this is a social process, it's a collective process, and it depends on lateral connections among working class people in the port cities, on the docks, on board the ships. So that, I think, is a very important thing, that it kind of helps us to understand a different sort of take on what running away actually is. Now, I want to also add that the narratives that were written about the experience of self-emancipated people feed into this distortion and individualism of those accounts. Now, I'm actually still working on this, but I would give you this hypothesis. Everybody knows that a number of the narratives written by enslaved people were assisted, if not actually written, by white abolitionists. But here's my working hypothesis. The greater the involvement of white middle-class abolitionists in the creation of the narrative, the more individualistic that narrative will be, and the less would be the attention paid to the social and collective dimensions of escape. Okay, so, and then one more thing that I think understanding escape by sea helps us to do, it just helps us to rethink our interpretation of what abolitionism is. For many years, the scholarship on the resistance of enslaved people and the abolitionist movement were kept separate. Now, Manisha Sinha has actually changed that situation decisively. The book I wrote about the Amistad Rebellion was about the same thing, the collaboration of African insurrectionists and mostly white middle-class abolitionists in the New Haven jail in 1839, 40, and 41. But we are now seeing that abolition is not a gift from on high, not a gift from middle and upper class enlightened men, but now much more a matter of resistance from below, in which fugitives, dockers, sailors, market women, and all the rest are playing very important roles. And by the way, I would add that student of mine, a former student of mine, Jesse Olsofsky, his forthcoming book is going to show how fugitives actually educated the abolitionist movement about the realities of slavery. So in this sense, this maritime system of escape is part of that education. So let's conclude with William Powell, a sailor abolitionist, and Mahama Gardo Bakwakwa, a sailor/fugitive. These folks are very important agents of history. This powerful connection was reiterated again and again and again, hundreds and thousands of times, and this helped to generate the movement towards civil war in 1861. Runaways were one cause among many, certainly, but they were a major cause, as I think all scholars are now beginning to see. With the help of other workers, fugitives transgressed and defied boundaries, and in this way, the motley crew made history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for that riveting and informative talk. Let me go first to see whether or not anybody from the audience here has any questions. If you do, just go to the mic. If not, we go to the online. Yes, go ahead, Dr. Spencer. Cruz.
Thank you for a terrific presentation. My first question, so when does your book come out? Because you're right that the focus has been on land, and it's just now beginning to look more to the sea and to the water as a way of escape. And one of the thoughts I had as you're talking about the involvement of white abolitionists in the narratives, do you think it's also an effort to create a heroic figure so that it shows an individual is much like us in the North, and therefore it's empathetic, and it does take away from the collective work and the idea that you have to have others help you, but they're good people in and of themselves?
Yes, thank you very much. The book is probably not going to come out until 2023. That remains to be seen. It depends on my access to archives, so I can't be certain. But quite a lot of the book is drafted already. I'd say 7 of 8 chapters, but I do have specific parts I need to fill in. Yes, I do believe that the abolitionist goal in producing these narratives was to humanize people who ran away, to create them as heroic figures. I mean, I personally think they are heroic figures. I mean, the risks that they took, the courage. I mean, one of the most remarkable things about this book is living with the powerful political will of these people to be free. It's just absolutely inspiring, the things that they are willing to do. And they frequently fail, and they suffer for it, and they pay with the flesh on their backs. So I do think this is part of a very specific abolitionist strategy. But let me give you one example of how I think this thing works with the white abolitionist versus the other sort of interpretation. And this actually goes back to the Amistad story. White abolitionists would tell the story of the man who led the Amistad Rebellion. His name was Sengbe, or Sinke, as it was called in the United States, of prying a nail out of a wooden block and using that to pick a lock and to become free. And so he is actually the superhuman hero. He's the great man, you might say. But I found evidence to show that 2 of the Amistad Africans were trained blacksmiths. So they knew exactly how to deal with those locks. They knew the principles of metal, and that it was actually their collective knowledge, probably handed down over several generations, about how to be a metal worker that led to the freedom of those people and their capture of that vessel. So there are really different ways of thinking about these issues.
Good. Thank you, Marcus. Connor?
Thank you so much for such a generative and really generous discussion. So I'm thinking a lot with your talk about Stephanie Camp's work on the gendered role of fugitivity on land. And so I'm just curious as to whether you have any sort of hypothesis of how gender might organize the maritime sort of fugitivity and what you've found so far. Thank you.
Excuse me. This is a really important question for a variety of reasons. One is that we do know that in general, women made up a smaller part well, around 20% of those who engaged in grand marinage. It looks like the number is quite similar for people who escape by sea. But there's an additional complication in that the waterfront, with the exception of those market women, is a very male workspace. So one of the things that we find is that women, including, for example, most famously, Harriet Jacobs, manages to get on board a ship while dressed as a sailor. So one of the things that the gendered nature of the waterfront actually does is encourage other kinds of creativity so that people can navigate that space. But given that, it is interesting to me that a lot of people could still get away. There are a lot of women with families who manage to get away. Now that does require a very secure understanding of someone that you can trust on board the ship. But I do believe that Stephanie Camp's work on rival geographies needs to be extended to the decks of ships, to the holds of ships, to the lower decks of ships, to the docks and all the rest, and to figure out how people are using those spaces of resistance. I think it's a very important question, and I will simply admit that I have more to learn on this topic at this point, so I expect to have a better answer for you a little later on.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much for such a valuable talk. I think what seemed really striking to me, Professor Redeker, is how much of a through line placemaking seemed to be. And so you speak quite a bit about the sea and proximity to the sea with regards to like practical opportunities. And I was wondering, particularly with regards to the Frederick Douglass example, as well as Mahoma's testimony, if you could speak a bit to proximity to water as like fundamentally shaping people's experiences and the imaginary of people outside of purely from like a practicality of interpersonal access.
Yes, another good question. There is absolutely no doubt that proximity to the sea and the kinds of knowledge that one can gain at sea is tremendously advantageous to successful escape. But it's not exclusively necessary. In other words, you do have people who come from, let's say, the interior of South Carolina. There's a man who makes his way to Charleston. He doesn't know very much about the docks, and he sort of gets lucky, and he manages to get aboard a ship. He manages to escape. So it's not absolutely required, but he depended upon the goodwill of other people to help him when he didn't know what to do. So I'd say the knowledge of the waterfront, and here too we have, this is the place where women's knowledge becomes very important, because these ships that come into the southern ports frequently will come and go numerous times, allowing these market women to develop relationships over time with sailors on board those ships. So the question is, what kinds of relationships are formed there? What kinds of trust develops? This trust, I have to emphasize, is really extremely important. I mean, whatever place you are in, you need to know who you can trust in that situation. And there are some people, like these market women, like dock workers, saying, this ship is coming in next week, and you can trust this man. He will get you to New York. He will get you to Boston. So it's hard to find detailed evidence about this, but we know it's going on. And this is, by the way, another aspect of Julia Scott's great work on the circulation of people and the knowledge that they have, and the knowledge they have of multiple places. This is the cosmopolitanism of life at sea. People like William Powell knew a lot. They had been in a lot of different places, and that's part of their effectiveness as not conductors, we get away from the landed metaphor, as pilots in this maritime circuit. And let me just add, one of the big dilemmas of this whole project is trying to figure out what to call this thing. If it's not exactly the Underground Railroad, if that's misleading, what are we going to call it? An overseas sailway? We'll see. But for now, I'm just calling it a maritime system of escape.
Thanks. Have you got any questions from on folks online?
Hi, there are no questions online, but I'll ask another question if that's all right. So, Professor Redeker, I was really intrigued to find out about William Powell's role, but I was most intrigued to find out that he was actually born to a Native American mother. And I was wondering if you knew which nation she was from, maybe like a Haudenosaunee nation in New York. And I'm also wondering if you found any evidence of Native and African American solidarity, especially as you're shifting away from this sort of white abolitionist narrative and into thinking about more maybe Powell's writings in local newspapers or other sources that speak more to these social and collective processes. Thanks.
Yes. I haven't been able to find out much about William Powell's mother, but I can tell you that William Powell himself also married a Native American woman and that she was Narragansett. He probably met her in New Bedford. He seems to have married her in the early 1830s, and they ran the boarding house together. She was also, by the way, an abolitionist and served in some offices within abolitionist organizations. But let me tell you one thing about another female ancestor, William Powell. And to me, I mean, William Powell was really a brilliant guy. He was really a thinker. Okay, so it's the early 1850s, and the Fugitive Slave Act is in force. He sees the American government taking people to Liberia, and so William Powell submits a petition to the New York State Legislature asking for money for him to take his family to Liverpool. And I want you to get the argument that he makes, because this to me is just tremendous. Talk about valuing women's labor. William Powell says that his great-grandmother, his great-grandmother was the cook at the Continental Congress at the time when they drafted the Declaration of Independence. And Powell then makes the argument that she had a material stake in creating American freedom. Isn't this tremendous? This is like social reproduction theory in 1851 or whenever Powell wrote this. Of course, the legislature didn't give him money. He went anyway, but this is a sign that he was really, he was thinking about women's work and its value, and he understood that somebody had to feed Jefferson and that crew, and that just turned out to be his great-grandmother.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no other questions, can we all just thank Professor Whitaker? Thank you very, very, very much, Marcus. Deeply appreciated. Thank you.
My pleasure, Tony. All the best to you, and good luck with all the great work at the center.
All right, thanks again. Good. Dr. Crew?
First of all, thank you all for being here this afternoon. I think we'll agree that this was a very powerful set of presentations this afternoon. We had terrific speakers all along the way, and I want to thank them all for their contributions. Earlier, I turned to Professor Bogues, and when Desiree had finished speaking, saying, "This is really very, very good," and he says to me, "This is what we do." And I think it's absolutely true. This is what the center does. It really makes sure that we are looking at important questions involving important people who are doing important work, to make sure that the rest of the world is aware of all the good things that are happening, all the thoughtful things that are happening in the world around us. And this is why I think the last 10 years have been so successful for the center, and why we also put pressure on Tony and the rest of the staff to make sure the next 10 years are just as successful. So once again, thank you all for coming this afternoon. I learned an awful lot, and I hope you did as well. And let's once again thank the speakers and the staff for a wonderful presentation.